welcome to Living One. I'm your host, Sylvia Crossman. Living One is a monthly webinar series now in its 5th year, in which presenters from around the world share their vision of a future where all Earth beings live as one community, in peace, dignity, and freedom. We ask the question, we know what's wrong, but what does right look like? Today, we have the second session of our 4th and final 2023 series, Contemplative Activism and Nonviolent Action. All radical and long-lasting social justice movements, such as the Indian Salt March and American Civil Rights, are rooted in practices of contemplative activism, reflective of nature's principles and ethics of nonviolence. The 4 speakers in this series will reflect on their personal, transformative work and engagement in nonviolent action. Our guest today is Jim Torczyner. Jim is a professor of social work at McGill University and founder of the McGill Middle East Program in Civil Society and Peace Building and Project Genesis, a grassroots nonprofit community organization that empowers people from diverse backgrounds to advocate for entitlements, to change social policy, and to develop alternative community organizations. He is also the author of Rights-Based Community Practice and Academic Activism in a Turbulent World, putting theory into practice in Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. But before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are all currently on various different Indigenous lands. I am currently on the ancestral homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, which includes the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. This land exists also as a place of trade with other Indigenous communities, including the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Menominee, Sauk, and Meskwaki. The Krulo Center for Nonviolence is located on the homelands of the grizzly bear, Takelma, Daku Bedite, coyote, coho salmon, golden eagle, and gray wolf. Jim will be speaking for about 45 minutes, after which we will have 15 minutes for a question and answer. Please keep your microphone muted to avoid any unintended interruptions. If you have any questions for Jim, you can type them into the chat and we will read them out after the presentation. For anyone who isn't familiar with the Zoom chat function, if you move your cursor towards the bottom left of your screen, you will see a number of icons appear, one of which is the chat function. If you click on that, the chat will appear where you can type any questions or comments as we go. This Zoom session will be recorded, so if you would feel more comfortable leaving your camera off or changing your Zoom name, please do so. Finally, we ask that all of us participate with full respect and attention to each other in the spirit of peace and wisdom that Living One seeks to foster. So without further ado, we welcome Jim Torczyner.
Hi. With an introduction like that, makes my bald head blush. What can I say? But
well, we're very glad to have you here, Jim.
Well, thank you
for joining us. Yeah, absolutely. To start us off, do you want to tell us a little bit about just your personal arc, how you got to where you are today, and just what set you on the path of nonviolence?
I can start there. I thought you were going to start me off with a question about how do I see nonviolence.
Well, you're welcome to go there as well.
All right, let me start there because I kind of had that in my head, and then I'll weave back to how I got there. And it was many years ago that a Sicilian architect and community organizer by the name of Danilo Dolci, who spent World War II in Mussolini's prison as a conscientious objector, and spent his life really as a nonviolent activist. And I brought him to McGill, and a student asked him, how do you define nonviolence? And he said, it's really the wrong question, because nonviolence is what you don't do, and civil disobedience is what you don't obey. But the real questions are about what do you do and what do you obey, and how does that get translated into not only how we behave, but certainly how we organize. And that stuck with me over all these years. And I think it's the right point of departure, because all too often we kind of conceptualize our goals in terms of the negative, in terms of what we don't want and what we don't like. And to create a different future, it got to be premised not on what we don't like, but on what we do like, what we want to preserve, what we want to share. So the purpose of all that and the purpose of nonviolence is really to promote coexistence. And so the questions become, how do we promote coexistence in what we do, in what we say, in how we relate to other people, how we relate to people in authority, how do we relate to change? So on that, over the years, and now I'll go backwards a bit. I grew up in New York City in a Jewish, Black, Cuban, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Irish neighborhood. Before New York City became a place only for people with lots of money. I also grew up as the child of Holocaust survivors. My father was in Dachau and in Buchenwald. And it was my mother who actually rescued my father from Dachau, and she taught me never again. Her view of coexistence was, don't do anything you're ashamed of. And if you're not ashamed of it, then do it in their face.
Very bold.
So, and it was that boldness. She did not have much of an education. She came from a very poor family. But that inner boldness and being in touch with that boldness and being able to harness it and turn it into an act of saving my father was kind of the subliminal message I got my entire life. And growing up in that kind of neighborhood in New York, not being very tall and trying to avoid fist fights. That was a really good approach. So I grew up in New York. My parents had an incredible love story until they got to New York. My mother rescued my father from Dachau. He went back to get the rest of the family out. He got caught again, was sent to Buchenwald. He escaped from Buchenwald, came down the wrong side of the Pyrenees and ended up in a French camp for being originally from Austria. But he said that was good when I moved to Quebec, because the French you could bribe, which is how he got himself out of the French camp, and ended up in Lisbon meeting my mother a year and a half later. And from there, the only country that would take them was Cuba. And they went to Cuba and then ultimately to New York. And my mother said, I'm not moving ever again. Because of their experiences in the war, my father became quite religious. And he said, if his wife could do what she did, there must be a God. My mother became just the opposite. And she said, if I had to do this, there can't be a God. So this kind of geared me for a later life in trying to resolve religious conflicts or conflicts between people who hold very powerful beliefs. That became my role as a kid. I didn't care about school very much. And I got involved first in the civil rights movement because my mom's been right. Never again is never again to anybody. And if you see something, do something about it. So that was a bit of my upbringing.
Yeah.
And then after spending time in the South, I ended up working in Spanish Harlem with street gangs.
Yeah.
And then when I was 19, I decided, well, I should do something for my own people. And I moved to Israel with my first girlfriend, who is not Jewish, which was a whole other story, but that's about religious kind of interlocutors. What can I say? But anyway, and there I was really fortunate. I had a boss, a mentor, who remained my mentor for his whole life. He passed away a couple of years ago at 92.
Wow.
Who founded all of the progressive social justice movements in Israel over a 40-year period.
Mm-hmm.
And he hired me to work with street gangs in Jerusalem doing social work. But he had a totally different view of it. His view was we tend to psychopathologize young people about their family dynamics and other things that have gone wrong. Mm. But we're missing the game. Delinquency is not a result of family dysfunction. It's a result of societal dysfunction that doesn't provide the same opportunities for young people who come from disadvantaged communities as they do for the wealthy. And you cannot expect young people to change if our institutions don't change. And out of his work, our work, came the Israeli Black Panther movement, similar to the American Black Panther movement, but totally committed to nonviolence, which became a political force, was elected to every Knesset for the next 30 years until they formed a coalition with the communists that finished them and the communists. But, you know, and in doing that, I found myself 23 years old, arguing with the finance minister in the Knesset and understanding pretty good at protest. That's instinctual within me, but not very good on solutions. And I could not understand anything the finance minister was yapping about in terms of the economic. I had a 1.8 average as an undergraduate because I wanted to avoid Vietnam. And the worse you did in school, the longer your deferment. What did I know? And, I wrote a book and I wrapped it in my transcripts and I sent it to Berkeley with a note: don't judge a book by its cover. This is what I've done. This is what I've written. I want a PhD. And Berkeley in 1969 took me. I don't know if Berkeley would do that today. I'd like to hope that they still would. But I can tell you most academic institutions wouldn't. And part of what's gone wrong with academia, in my view, is it plays to the ratings rather than to the communities it ought to be serving, including students and including other support staff who work there. Anyway, so I did that, and I was going to go right back to the Middle East because I developed these ideas, cross-border ideas too. But then my mom passed away very young, very sudden. My father was ill. I couldn't leave. So I figured I'd take a teaching job. You can leave that easily. Unlike making a commitment to a community. So I started interviewing in your hometown, Chicago. Wherever I interviewed, I said, look, if you, I can't teach what I teach unless I do it. And if I do it well, there'll be a reaction. And if you can't back the values behind this, don't hire me.
Mm.
And university, your hometown, said, "You're right, we won't hire you."
Yeah.
But McGill, bless its conservative instincts and soul, it's really interesting how the idea of academic freedom falls very well both with the left and the right. So, from a conservative perspective, they believed in it. And in fact, they really did back me for the first 30 years. I was supposed to be there 1 year. I ended up there 49 because I could reinvent myself and do these things until the university really began to change. So when I got to Montreal, I developed Project Genesis, taking the most multi-ethnic community in Canada at the time in a divided city, divided by language. Language and religion were tied to institutions. Catholics had their own school, Protestants had theirs. That wasn't enough. You had Catholic French schools and Catholic English schools and Protestant ones, and which meant that people from different backgrounds, other than the very poor, didn't live side by side. They lived in communities where the kids were going to go to school, hardly ever meeting the other. And I saw that as a way, as a method of disempowering people from understanding their commonalities and what they can do together to create change. So I grabbed 4 students and I said, let's knock on doors and let's see what's going on. And I opened the book with this story because this story really impacted on me in a very profound way. And it was this one person who I met in this story who gave me the idea for all the work that I've done since then. So I knocked on this door, and often you got to go back a few times for good reasons. Why should somebody open their door just to you? You may think, we may think we have the most important message to transmit. You know what? People are busy and they got their own lives and they want to know what you're selling. So you gotta, and you come and say, well, I'm not selling Bibles, I'm not selling vacations, I'm not selling anything other than the idea that you have rights. Which is, so I knocked on this one door, a basement apartment, a few times, and finally this man let me in. And right away I looked around and everything in his apartment was painted black. The floors, the windows, the walls, the ceiling. And I kind of picked up the feeling. So kind of, because I grew up this way, I right away instinctively looked at his arm. And there was a tattoo from the concentration camps. So all of a sudden, I had a sense. And I started speaking to him. I speak English, I speak Hebrew. I don't speak Yiddish, and my French was very poor at the time. He spoke Yiddish and Polish, no English, and no Hebrew. So I didn't know what to do, but in the end, we didn't have an office or anything. On a piece of paper, I wrote my name and my phone number, and I looked in his eyes, because you can talk to people, sometimes even better if you don't have a common language. But look, I just looked in his eyes, and I went like this, and he shook his head. And a few weeks later, the police called me. Do I know him? So I explained what I did know. And I said, why are you contacting me? And they say, well, we don't know what to do. I said, what do you mean? Well, every month or so, we find him in the middle of the night, out in the street, stark naked, yelling and screaming. And I said, well, what do you do? Well, we pick him up. And then what? Well, we either take him to the hospital or to the station. And then what? Well, then we take him back home, or he gets back home. And then what? Well, then we pick him up again a month later. So I figured there's more to this story. So I came back with the archivist at Canadian Jewish Congress, who spoke both Polish and Yiddish. So he would translate. So we go there. And this man explained to me how he survived Treblinka, another concentration camp. And he was informed of the day that he was going to be murdered. They had a list. And his very courageous friends in his bunk decided they would not let that happen. And they carved out a little space in the wall of the bunk where they could cram him into during the day. And he would stand there all day, couldn't eat, couldn't talk, couldn't go to the bathroom. And at night, they'd let him out. And somehow this man ended up from there in the streets of Montreal, within walking distance of services, of synagogues. No one knew him. No one knew about him. And then the most amazing thing happened. A middle-aged Black woman knocks on the door and gives him some ripped clothes and $1. And I'm looking at him, and you can see a slight change. Holocaust survivors, you learn who they are by looking at each of their eyes separately, because they've had different experiences. I can't really explain that. It's something you know. I saw that slight change in one of his eyes, like I used to see in my father's eyes. So I went up to found out where this woman lived, and I went up to her apartment and I said, you don't by any means speak Polish? She said, no, I don't speak Polish. And so what's the story? She says, I don't have to speak Polish. As a Black woman, I can see in that man's eyes, I can see his pain. Let me tell you something. Those clothes aren't torn. I tear them and I bring them to him. And then I give him $1 to fix them, because every human being has the right to feel that they're a part of something. Him too. That woman, just here, a PhD from Berkeley, quite the thing. This woman taught me a hell of a lot more in that one afternoon than I'd learned in most other places. And I said, well, if there's one woman like her, there got to be others. And there are people who can't really advocate for themselves, but their neighbors can. If we find them, if we talk to them, if we break down the barriers of language and religion and all that between neighbors, and focus on people doing the right thing, not because there's any particular financial incentive or advantage to their doing the right thing, but doing it because they know it's the right thing. How do we tap that so that people act on their best instincts? This whole business about, and I get it, about what's in it for you, and how do you meet people on that level? Yeah, there's truth to that, but it's a limited truth. There's a much bigger truth than that. And that is the things that we live for, our relationships, our trust, or understanding, hope, doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, not because we have to. And I'm going to go find me people like that. And after a while, we ended up with 40 people like that who ranged in age from 18 to 80, represented the diversity of an amazing community. And we began to go to the social services and say, hey, look, we're finding people and they need help. They either don't know about you or they've tried and they haven't been able to manage the bureaucracy. We're organizers. And we're coming across people with kind of serious individual needs. If we stop and we try and do this work with each individual, we'll never get to the organizing issues, which is another dilemma, right? How about if we refer them to you and you take it from there? Now, if the institutions would have said, that's a great idea, Project Genesis would never have happened. And what I developed in the Middle East would never have happened either. But instead, they said to me that I was lying, that people know about their services, and who are we to impose our values that they need help when they don't ask for it themselves? So we doubled their caseload in 6 months. You won't come to them, we're going to bring them to you. And that started this whole movement. Project Genesis is still around 50 years later. I haven't been involved in many years. And it developed into an organization where anyone who volunteers for 3 months is a member. Members elect the board. There are no wealthy people on the board, although we accept contributions, but we do. The whole idea is to popularize the notion of rights. So the storefront is located next to a fish store and next to a beauty parlor. You go in, you buy your fish, you go in there, you get your hair done, and you come into our place and you get your rights. Normalizing the concept. Well, same way you go shopping for your rights, they belong to you. And you come into our storefront and you'll see someone who looks just like you, who in fact could be your neighbor, who's gone through our training. And someone will come in one day asking for advice. We'll give them advice. They often come back the next day and say, how do I sign up? Because people want to be able to contribute. It doesn't have to be dragged out of them. Just the opportunity has to be there. And there are 40 volunteers in this storefront. They each take shifts. The other part of it is don't ask people what they can't do. Ask them what they can and work with that. What do we often do in community organizations? We know how to recruit. We don't know how to let people leave, and we guilt people into staying. Instead of, it's a natural process. There are times you can give more and there are times you can't. That ought to be respected. That ought to be blessed. That ought to be welcomed. To create a more fluid kind of system where you can move in, you can move out, and you try and avoid the problems of that Robert Michel's called the iron law of oligarchy, that over time power gets concentrated in the hands of a few simply because of the control over the flow of information. If you're there too long, you know everything, right? It's hard for new people. So how do you make that happen? The storefront helps about 30,000 people a day. But in addition to that, there's some other components. Continual outreach. Often in our work, outreach is something we do to start a program. We introduce ourselves. This is what we're doing. And we get our core group, and then we forget about them. But we forget about outreach. But outreach is the lifeblood of any relationship between two people or between organizers and their community. Outreach, and I'll get back to this concept soon, is a measure of reciprocity. When I go to you and I knock on your door and I ask your permission to come inside and ask you if you're available, or can I come back some other time, when I have no control at all. All that it is are two people having a conversation and a relationship. That's reciprocity. A totally different experience than what most people feel when they go for help for social services, because they only go when you're at your weakest point. So you go when you're at your weakest to an organization that's probably upstairs somewhere with glass doors and buzzers you have to press to get in. So the whole business that's happened now. And you're needy, and the social worker sees you as a needy kind of consumer. What do I have that I can give you? But that same person in their community may not be needy at all. They, in fact, may be leaders. They may be powerful people. They may have influence. They may have desire to make things happen. You won't see it in that kind of interview. You're more likely to see it when you knock on someone else's door. I tend to knock on two doors at the same time, hoping they both come out. And then I know, because they often don't know each other. So I'll look at one, I'll look at the other and say, I don't know if you two know each other, but I don't know either of you. Can one of you invite me in? And then they'll look at each other, and one of them will, usually, right? Both of them usually don't say no. And then all of a sudden, I'm also hopefully creating a little bit of contact between neighbors. And not, but I know that people feel more comfortable when they're not alone with a stranger, especially a single man, when you knock on somebody's door, especially for the elderly. Well, it's all a matter of conceptualizing that the relationships that you want to form are really very important, and you take as much time in making a good impression as you would in a job interview, in meeting someone for the first time, whatever. People are important. So in addition to the storefront outreach, we have community organizers and lawyers. And over the years, we've taken on some remarkable issues and been able to put together some incredible coalitions. So one was homeless people in Montreal could not get welfare because they did not have an address. And I had read in the papers that 200 people had died homeless in the streets one winter. And I was appalled. And the agencies and government officials were saying, well, they don't come to us. And I was saying, I bet you they do. And you repel them. You don't invite them in. So I want to do a research project studying from the last known fact about these 200 people and working backwards. What led to their dying in the streets? And the first individual I looked into, his name was Lyle Severson. He died with 11 cents in his pocket in front of Montreal City Hall, right in full view of the $100,000 fancy glass windows that the mayor had just installed. So and I said, well, how am I going to investigate this? Who am I? So I called up the chief coroner of Quebec, and I said, look, the only way I can get anywhere here is if I have authority to go to these institutions and ask them questions. He said, what do you want? And I said, I want to be a deputy coroner. And he said, you got it. And then he says with this exquisite French accent, I see myself as Quincy. I don't know if any of you remember that television show about a coroner who was a social activist and all that stuff. That's how he saw himself. He made me a deputy coroner. I then went to the head of the welfare office in the neighborhood that Lyle had lived in. And I asked what the story was. And they said, well, he's been on welfare for a long time, that he had at one point steady jobs and a family. And then something at work fell on his head and he couldn't work anymore. And his family fell apart. And every few months, he just had this thing he had to move. You have to get up and go. And the director says, I guess that's when he ran out of money. So let me ask you a question, though. You know that this man's entire ability to live depends on the money that you give him. And he doesn't show up for a month, 2 months, 3 months. And what do? We don't do anything. So what do you mean? You think it's our job to go looking for these people when they don't show up for their check? I say, you're damn right. I think it's your job. That's exactly what your job is. Mm-hmm. It's not another job. It's not. That's what you're supposed to be doing. No. The law says that you have to have an address. So I got together with my friends in the law school and we discovered, well, the law doesn't say that. The law says you have to be a resident. You can live in a tree and be a resident if you want to be. You don't need to have an address. Being a resident means that for 30 days you have lived in that province, not where or how or with whom. You've been there. So we started a campaign to recognize community groups, churches, synagogues, mosques, shelters as addresses for the homeless, where they could try to find something that'll work for everybody, where they could pick up their checks, and at the same time be in the hands of a welcoming community that cares about them and says, hey, okay, here's your check. Can we help you in some other way? You know, there are other people here you might want to meet. Now, create something out of this. And the mayor said, no way. We don't want to become the homeless capital of Canada, that homeless people will get on a plane and fly to Montreal because they know they can get welfare. I said, are you serious? Homeless jet setters flying in from across Canada to pick up a welfare check? You ought to look out that window of yours a bit more often and see how people are living and who they are. No, we won't do it. We put together a coalition, Jewish grandmothers at Project Genesis, the leadership of the Mohawk Reserve on Montreal Island, whole bunch of various ethnic groups, etc., because the city of Montreal had adopted a new liberal thing that there would be a question period where people could come up and ask questions. So we all came down, and before that I took some students out and I said, well, we shouldn't be asking the questions. Let's round up homeless people. Let's have them ask the questions. And we all went to City Hall with the media there and the press there, and embarrassed the hell out of the mayor and the leaders of the Mohawk, saying, who are you saying needs an address? We need an address? Forget it. You need an address. We don't need an address. This is our land. You don't decide where we have to live, et cetera, et cetera. the Gazette ran an editorial, if welfare is not for the homeless, and for God's sake, who is it for, et cetera, et cetera. Long, long story, as each of these stories are, because change never comes easy. Yeah, they changed the law. And I could go on and on with many, many kind of examples of that. They created a community council for all these different ethnic groups. They government of Quebec decided to set up a special police force to investigate welfare recipients. We sued the government. A coalition of 4 law students and 4 social work students got together with Project Genesis, and we took on 7 government lawyers, plus lawyers from other provinces that wanted to pass similar laws, so they got standing in this at the court. And we won. We canceled that law. But I don't know, one of the things I think of, and the last example I'll give, was the bank in Nova Scotia got robbed on Canadian Thanksgiving. And they did a good job. They came in through the roof, and then they ordered pizza that came in through the door, and they wiped out 600 safe deposit boxes. Who owned those boxes? People in the neighborhood. They weren't $1 million kind of wealth. These were people, if they had a little bit and they wanted to keep it safe, they kept it there. If they had something from the old country, they kept it there. We estimated from those 600 safe deposit boxes that got robbed, roughly about $1,000 per person, roughly millions of dollars. And we went to the bank and said, well, you gotta do something for these people. No, we don't. What do you mean? Well, safe deposit boxes under banking law are a service. They're not insured. And we don't have to, if your safe deposit box gets robbed, forget it. Bank's not responsible. So now we have to organize and find and locate 600 people who had their safe deposit boxes robbed. How do you do that? You hang around the bank and see who's showing up. So we did. We collected some 300 names, invited them to a meeting, began to organize. Then told the vice president of Scotiabank, a big national bank in Canada, and said, well, there are really 2 choices here. You can respect your social responsibilities to this community, irrespective of what the law says. And we will hail you as the most progressive bank in North America, et cetera, what great things you're doing. Or we're going to organize a boycott of your bank and going to wish you the best of luck in your new job as a teller in Chicoutimi, which is this tiny town in northern Quebec. He wasn't going to do it, brought in his fancy lawyers from Toronto, said, no, I don't like the image, etc. In the end, he did it. And not only did they, the way they did it, we said is, hey, we have all these volunteers. We'll process these claims for you. And we're not going to back phony claims. And there were some. This guy all of a sudden remembered he had $500,000 worth of diamonds in the safe deposit box. Good luck. We're not going to play that game. We're going to do it. It's job here. And at the end of the day, and it shows you what's possible, we created an organization called the Victims of the Bank. And one of the leaders of the victims and the lawyer representing the insurance company for the bank both got elected to our board.
Mm.
And not only, and they worked together and they solved it. You know, people got reimbursed when they didn't have to, but when somehow, either by persuasion or by pressure, pressure doesn't mean violence. You can convince people that if they're not doing the right thing, why they should. So all that was, you see, you're supposed to keep me on track, but all this is to sort of get to the question, how did I get into nonviolence and all that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
First of all, the civil rights movement was premised on nonviolent resistance. And we were trained on how you could be dragged down the street by your hair. I had some then. And how not to resist, how to do the opposite of what your instincts are. Mm. If someone's beating you up, you want to defend yourself. And we got into that because of the philosophy behind it. It was a way of being. That if you want to change things, you have to present a different example by everything that you do. So let me take that a bit further. Knocking on doors takes the idea of reciprocity and lays it at people's doorsteps. It's what you do. It's not the idea of having reciprocal relationships. It's engaging in them. Mm-hmm. So, the idea of utilizing violence, when I was really little, when I was 8 and 9, having dreams of rescuing my father from Dachau, and I would beat up all these Nazis and shoot them and do things. I've never held a gun in my life, but, yeah. But fortunately, I outgrew that. Mm-hmm. And it's not difficult to outgrow it.
Yeah.
When you're growing into something else, when it's not like rejecting violence and now what? It's that you are accepting another way of creating change. Mm-hmm. So all this to say that the idea of nonviolence is how to promote coexistence. Mm-hmm. And what I discovered over time, and I should say I had no idea that was the idea of nonviolence. My idea was, we're going to go do the right thing. We're going to sit in lunch counters. We'll demonstrate, and we'll win because it's the good and the right thing. And then we'll go home and everything will be fine. Mm-hmm. Nothing was fine.
Right.
Well, so over time, and then either you make a decision, either you stay in it because that you've made a decision, that's how you want to lead your life. Mm-hmm. Or as like when I was at Berkeley, the folks who went out to the demonstration and then that was it. Or like today at universities, you gave this introduction, which I really respect, about being on native land. But now every professor signs their email, we are on this native land, blah, 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 blah. They go on for about a half a page, and that's it. They've done their job. They've now shown their sympathy toward, and now they don't have to do anything else. Right. Well, so out of all this, three main principles that guide my work. One is universality. That is, all people share the same rights. Simple. But to make that happen, you need a legal structure which specifies and protects those rights. It's not just a theoretical thing. Right. Second is reciprocity, that each of us have a right to be in reciprocal relationships with ourselves, with our families, with our communities, with our political institutions. And what does that mean? It means that we each have the opportunity to influence each other. It doesn't mean we get what we want all the time. And it doesn't mean that we don't change our mind some of the time. Sure. But we live in a framework of respect where I can influence you and you can influence me. And that is necessary for the rhythm of all our relationships, no matter with whom, no matter what they are. And the third is inclusion. And that is for those people, for example, who can't represent themselves. We have a responsibility to make sure that each and every person, irrespective of their ideas, irrespective of our likes and dislikes, every person has to be included in decisions that impact on their lives. And if they can't represent themselves, then the people around them, like the woman who helped that Holocaust survivor, we got to do it. Yeah. Not because we have to do it. No one's ordering us to do it. But we got to do it if we want to live in a society that is nonviolent, where we can coexist. So then, in the early 90s, after many, many years, I got to McGill for 1 year in 73. And I raised a son by myself, so all my work was local while he was young. When he went off to school, then I could start doing international work again. And that's when I decided to bring this model, if you call it that, of Project Genesis, first to Israel, then Jordan, and then Palestine. I do want to digress for a second. When I said that everybody has to be included, that includes the people you least agree with. That include the people you may be having the bloodiest confrontation with. That may have wronged you in the worst possible way. If they're not included in some form or another, there can't be a resolution. So part of it, and I'm mentioning that now because of what's happening in the Middle East these days. There's no question, and there shouldn't be a question in anybody's mind, that what Hamas did to these lefty kibbutzim, the kibbutzim on that border, these are all peaceniks. These are all lefties. That's why they're there. Was inhumane, horrible, inexcusable. I would also say the same for bombing innocent people who had nothing to do with this, who live in Gaza. It's not, and what bothers me a lot these days is the chants that are going back and forth. The Israelis are saying, rightfully so, you did this and this and this to us. Yeah, we're going to bomb you into the ground. And the Hamasniks say, we've been living in an open air prison for 60 years, etc. We don't have this, that, etc., etc. You know, of course we're going to do this. Well, neither side, until I think it's beginning to change in the last few days, but neither side was willing to say the Palestinian cause would be much better served if Palestinian leadership would say what Hamas did was horrible and was wrong. However, we are being bombed, we're being destroyed, our rights are not being respected. That is also wrong. Where do we move from here? And for the Israelis to be able to say, yeah, and bombing innocent people who have nothing to do with this terrorism and don't want to have anything to do with it is also wrong. Until both sides can acknowledge that about their own actions, they're not really going to be able to talk about change with the other side. Yeah. You got to be able to do that. So in 92, I brought the model to Israel, then to Jordan, and then to Palestine, having no clue at all as to how I would go about doing this. I had a clue about Israel. I spoke Hebrew. I knew Israel. I'd lived there. And my mentor was still there, who helped me pull together all kinds of people. But I had never been to Palestine because my own politics were such that the West Bank, Gaza, by that point I hadn't been there. They weren't my home. You don't go to someone else's house unless you're invited. No one's invited me, and why should they? What do I have to offer them? So I never set foot in the territories because I've been opposed to the occupation from the very, very beginning. I think they're better solutions. Anyway, and I hadn't been to Jordan either. So I said to myself, well, it's time to knock on doors. So how are you going to do it? Mm-hmm. McGill at that time really supported me. Just a quick aside, I had been on trial in 1980 for the illegal rescue of Ethiopian children being sold in the slave trade. And I was very guilty. And at my trial, the president of McGill came out and testified that he expected me to behave in this way and that he considered it to be part of my job. Yeah. That's why I stayed that long. After he left, McGill changed. So, and it was downhill ever since. But how did I get onto that?
You were talking about knocking on doors.
Yeah, but how did I get onto that? I had a connection in my head, but I lost it. Oh, I know how. Yeah. So I was telling you how supportive McGill was at the time.
Right. Right.
So the president of McGill wrote the president of the University of Jordan and said, I got a colleague here. He'd like to advance social work in the region. Would you agree to meet with him? And of course, the president of the University of Jordan wrote back saying, of course. You know, So I started to read as much as I could about Jordan and about the universities and about the communities and about the issues within Jordan. And well, it's a funny story, but who knew? I figured, okay, I got my appointment, got into my rented car. I drive. There was no real border yet then. I was there 2 weeks after the peace treaty got signed between Israel and Jordan. So I get to this area near Jericho and the Allenby Bridge, which is another story. And I get to this Israeli checkpoint. And I show him my papers, and I got a visa to Jordan, and everything's fine. He says, well, you can come across, but the car can't. I said, wait a second. No, I got to get to Oman, which is a 45-minute drive from here. I'm standing here. How am I going to get there? He says, not my problem. I said, well, why can't I just leave my car here? There's nobody here at all, you know. So it's not a parking lot. No, we don't protect cars. So I crossed the road. Now I'm in Palestine. The Palestinian young soldier looks just like the Israeli young soldier. And I said, hey, I'm going over to Jordan. I got this letter here from the university. I need to leave my car somewhere. Can I leave my car here? He said, is that a Jewish car? I said, now I'm sure it's Catholic. It's a Fiat. It's Italian. They're all Catholic over there. It's a Catholic. Is that a Jewish license plate? Yes. If the Jews won't guard their own car, we, the Palestinian people, will never, ever. I'm looking at these two 19-year-olds with submachine guns, getting very heated. I'm in a suit. I get in my car. I say, I don't know what I'm going to do. I get back to Jericho, where I see a big parking lot by the bus station. I drive up and I say, I'm going over to Jordan. Can I park here? Yeah, park over there. So I do. I took a taxi from there to the bridge. Then they met me on the other side. I had my first meetings in Jordan, knowing that here was the thing. There was no doubt that the University of Jordan wanted a relationship with McGill, wanted a stronger relationship with Canada. Jordan wanted all that. But there was every question whether or not they wanted a relationship with Israel. Because even though a peace treaty was signed, that said nothing to people on the streets. And there was a lot of wariness. So I had to figure something out which would respond to what they wanted, as well as on the Israeli side, where it was easier for me to get things going, and I had. That's another story. And at the same time, be able to contain it, to make it ambiguous enough so that I could create a space in which people over time could decide what kind of relationship they wanted to have with each other, if any. Well, but some framework in which they could buy into. And in Israel, we had already developed 2 centers connected to universities. That's what I was pushing for Jordan and Palestine as well. That's what Palestine wanted. Jordan, and there was no academic discipline of social work in Jordan. They wanted an academic program in social work. So I came up with an idea. I said, let's do this. Send me over 2 of your professors who have PhDs. We'll put them in a program focusing on community. They'll get masters in social work. We'll also focus on developing a curriculum for a school of social work in Jordan. They'll be with us for a year. They'll spend the second year of the fellowship back home implementing. They like that. And I said, okay, in parallel, there'll also be 2 Israelis. Okay. Your profs don't have to talk to them. We'll do nothing to kind of push them towards relationships. I just believe that if you get people who share the same values in the same room, they'll work it out. They don't need us. Well, but you do not have to have a formal relationship with Israel. Jordan has a relationship with McGill. Israel has a relationship with McGill. I'm an absent-minded professor. At times, I forget who I arranged which meeting for, and all of you are in the same place at the same time, but we can work it out. If that becomes an acceptable ground rule, let's do it. That was the starting point. It was a starting point to a program that ultimately impacted on over 1 million people. Mm. But look how. So the 2 Jordanians were men, older, in their 40s, religious, traditional. The 2 Israelis were both women. One, out in the open lesbian organizer from a kibbutz. And that's not something that gets talked about in Jordanian society. It's not something that was ever encountered before. And the other, who became known as my Bedouin daughter, was a Bedouin feminist who had organized her classmates when she was 10 that they would not look after the sheep unless they were allowed to go to school. And she won that. And in the end, she did her master's and her PhD with me, and through her own work, not me, got nominated for the Nobel Prize for some of her work. But she's a remarkable person. Amal Sana is her name. And they shared an office. Plus, there was another woman, an American Israeli, who was doing her PhD with me. So they're all together in one room. And when we had meetings, where the representatives of their institutions would come over, they would refuse to be photographed in the same photograph as the other. We'd photograph in blocks. Here was the Jordanian group, here was the Israeli group, but never a group together. Why? Because Jordanians were afraid that if a picture gets back there showing them with an Israeli and given the rumor mill, it could cost them. Yeah. I said, all right, I'll go with that. We did. Now, in the same way that when I knocked on doors, I never would have anticipated meeting that Holocaust survivor, I never could have anticipated what happened here. One of the 2 Jordanians who was coming to McGill in February. Let me go back one step. Before that, this was not only a program for the fellows, it was a program for the Arab and Jewish communities of Montreal as well. We wanted them involved. They became host families. They became volunteer tutors, etc. And then when we had a reception, because every act that we do tries to be reciprocal and inclusive. So we invited them all for an opening reception of the program in this big banquet room. At one end, we had one table with big signs. All the food was kosher. On the other table, on the other side, we had a big sign. All the food was halal. We figured we're making room for everybody. What did we discover? The Jews were eating the halal food because they wanted to check it out. The Muslims were eating the kosher food because they wanted to check that out. And then all of a sudden they were meeting in the middle of this big hall, eating each other's food, and they began to talk to each other. You never know. The exact opposite of what we had thought and predicted plays out when people figure it out for themselves. Anyway, so one of the Jordanians was walking in school, social work in February, and he passed out in a snowbank. And we rushed him up to the Royal Victoria Hospital, and which is right near the school. And it turned out he had double kidney failure. Quebec, first of all, Canadian medical system, we should buy it here. I got to tell you, it makes so much more sense than what goes on in the United States, as I've had to discover now that I'm back living in New York. Quebec says, if you got a transplant, we'll pay for that person to fly to Quebec. We'll pay for his entire medical needs and everything else, as well as the transplant recipient, even though that recipient is not a permanent resident of Quebec, will do it. Not only because medically it's what ought to be done, but you know what? For us, it's cheaper than keeping him on dialysis. Now tell me that doesn't work, right? So Mohammed Mani was his name. He had a brother outside of Amman who was prepared to donate a kidney. To do that, they had to match blood types. And the blood had to get from Amman to Montreal within 24 hours because of the sensitivity of the test. I don't know much about that. And there were no direct flights from Amman to Montreal at the time. Now there are. There were direct flights from Tel Aviv to Montreal. Now they're not, but back then there were. So what are we going to do? So I called up the president of the University of Jordan, who by now, for other reasons, a lot of it's in the book, we became close friends, but this sealed it. I said, hey, look, we got to get Mohammed's brother's blood to Montreal within 24 hours. The only thing I can think of is I have a friend who's an Israeli pilot. In the 67 war, he probably bombed your neighborhood. But he's a good man, and he's from a kibbutz. And let me tell you, his kibbutz is right on the Palestinian border. And in the village, that Palestinian village is on a mountain, and they don't have medical facilities. But my friend Danny opened up his kibbutz, so once a week, the fence gets open, these folks come in, they get all their medical needs treated for free. Well, he's not all Israelis are the same. He's a pilot. And he flies now for El Al. And they fly into Montreal. So if we can get him to Tel Aviv, I can call my friend and see what we can do about getting the blood then from Tel Aviv to Montreal within 24 hours. So the president says, all right, what do you need? I said, well, first of all, Ayman, the brother, needs some money to take the bus. So I'm in Montreal, et cetera, and get here and look after his needs a bit. So Fauzi, president of the university, says, done. I said, what do you mean done? You guys got such an enormous bureaucracy. How does it just get done? And he said, because I'm not going to the bureaucracy. Do you think I want to explain to my bureaucracy why 2 weeks after a peace treaty is signed with Israel, I'm now paying to send the Jordanian to go over to Tel Aviv? I'd rather pay for it out of my own pocket. And I say, you know what? You and I are very close. Well, there are lots of people like that. So, okay, now let me call my friend Danny. I called Danny, and then he says, give me a couple hours, I'll get back to you. He calls me back. He says, here's what we're doing. What? One, I changed my flight schedule. I ain't going to fly the blood directly into Montreal because I believe in it. Okay. Two, the deal is I will do that on one condition. So what's that? No, that you take me to Beauty's, this great place for breakfast in Montreal. After I deliver the blood, so you got yourself a deal. He says, okay, so here's what we do. Have them take the bus into Tel Aviv. No, I will pick them up. I will take them to my home where a nurse will take out the blood. We'll feed them dinner, etc., etc. I'll take them back to the bus station. I'll then go to the airport. I'll get on the plane. It won't be 24 hours. You'll have the blood in 14 hours. And sure enough, it arrived. Okay. And sure enough, I took them to Beauty's. Now, here's the thing. Yeah. One Israeli pilot who spent years bombing the other side. A Jordanian president of a university taking money out of his own pocket so that one of his faculty can get to Israel. You know, the peace treaty is brand new, to help save his life. All without governments, all without anything other than reaching out, knocking on doors, and finding people who share the same values. There are tons of them out there. So Mohammed's life got saved. He actually just retired a year ago from the University of Jordan, a year or two maybe. But what that did is it changed the entire contour of possibilities between Jews and Arabs by that simple act of the decent thing you and I would do for anyone that we knew if we were able to do it.
That's incredible.
That's basically what it's all about all the time.
Yeah.
So I want to know what nonviolence is. It's positive actions based on these ideas that make it happen. So then what happened? I mean, it's amazing. Then I got Jordan on board, and I'm visiting in Jordan, and I say, this is, and I say, well, Fauzi says, what can I do for you? And I said, well, I'd like to meet the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood. Says, what do you want to meet them for? We don't talk to those people. I said, well, here's what I figured. You don't talk to them. They don't recognize me. They don't talk to me. But until we do talk, they are standing on the outside, and they are going to stall whatever it is I'm trying to do. So why don't I go to them directly and talk to them? So they created this meeting. There was me and an interpreter and 6 of them. We all men, all had beards. And they know who I am. They know about me. So they asked me, why do I want to meet? And I said, well, because I have 2 questions. And I figured you're the best people to answer them. Well, what do you question? Well, let me start with the first question. I grew up Jewish in New York. I never met a Muslim until I started going to the Middle East. I have no idea what the values of social justice are in the Quran. And I took out a notebook and I said, I figure you're the best people to teach me. Teach me. And for 2 hours, they taught me. And you know what? The values aren't any different. We got different symbols, different this and that. They're all coming from the same place. And I love this stuff. I'm enjoying it. And when you're for real, people know if you're for real or not. So we go on, and the chemistry is changing. Here, I'm the distinguished professor from McGill, and these guys are outliers. Now, all of a sudden, the outliers are teaching the distinguished professor. That's reciprocity, right? But anyway, so then I said, after that, and the mood's changed. What's your second question? I said, here's my second question. I don't know if you'll like it as much as my first question, but here's my second question. Given all these wonderful values, you've spent 2 hours now teaching me, and I've taken notes, and I'm really appreciative, and I've learned a lot. Must you kind of throw monkey wrenches in whatever I'm trying to do here? Despite your values, because I'm Jewish. And the leader looked at me and he said, that's a very tough question. And I looked at him without knowing I was going to say it. I said, that's a Jewish answer. We both started laughing at the absurdity of my question and his response. But after that, the president told me, well, I'm very safe in Jordan. I said, I always felt safe. He said, yeah, but we've been looking after you. But now we look after you and we notice that the Brotherhood, they're also looking after you, except you don't know it, that either we are or they are. Right? I said, perfect. It's how things happen by being authentic. Coexistence is about trying to live an authentic life, even when we fail. But what else we got if we don't have that? So anyway, so back in the president's office, after all this, I said, well, we got things going in Jordan, but I started in Jordan because there was a treaty. I had some legal document to work with. There was no treaty. There was an Oslo process that had started with Israel and Palestine, but there certainly was no treaty. So I'm in the president's office and I say, look, what I'm trying to do can never take hold unless I get the Palestinians involved. Palestinians have a policy, and this is another one of the pieces. It's called an anti-normalization policy, which says that we will not have normal relations with Israel as long as there is an occupation. Okay. Other people say if the occupation is not normal and you change an abnormal situation by getting normal people together to change it. If you can't get those people to cross divides and work together, then it's never going to change. We're going to be stuck in this. But that was the dilemma. So I said, Fauzi, what do I do here? Well, he picks up the phone and he calls the president of An-Najah, a major university in Palestine located in Nablus. And by now my Arabic is picking up, so I can figure out the conversation. And he's basically telling the president of An-Najah, yeah, he's Jewish, but he's a good guy. He has something to offer. Come, I recommend that you meet him. That's how Palestine opened up for me, through that connection. Rami Hamdallah, who was the president of An-Najah at the time, I was with him when two of his children were killed. We became enormously close. Rami became the prime minister of Palestine. He resigned after a while because of all the bullshit. But yeah, it's about how you create those relationships without meaning to create them, just by trying to get the job done. So, well, I'm going off track, am I not?
It's been great, Jim. It's been great. I definitely want to make sure that everybody can ask questions if they have any. So anyone who's
Yes, I can light a cigar.
Watching now, if you have questions for Jim, go ahead and type them in the chat. But this has been incredible, Jim. Everything you've shared has been so informative and so inspiring, and there's such hopeful undertones of the whole thing in your work and everything that you've inspired around the world. It's incredible. So thank you so much for sharing all of this with us.
Hey, nobody that I know, says no to gay or you. So.
Well, that's what we're banking on. But yeah, any final questions, anybody, before we wrap up? Alrighty, that sounds really good. Jim, thank you so much for taking all this time with us today. This has been just incredible and so inspiring. We really appreciate you being here.
Happy to do it. But
Wonderful.
No one wants to ask me anything.
Anybody? Oh yeah, looks like somebody's hand raised. Go ahead. We'll give her a sec to type in the chat. Or if you'd like to unmute, you can go ahead as well if that's easier.
I'd just like to say thank you. I don't know what else to say.
Thank you, Mike.
Well, thank you. I'm at a disadvantage because I don't know the group.
Yes, right. Someone did type in the chat. They're wondering what kind of cigar you're smoking.
This is Nicaraguan, which I can never pronounce. There are only two places to get Cuban cigars: in Cuba, or, you never believe it, at the Allenby Bridge crossing into Jordan, where they got the cheapest Cuban cigars I've ever seen. For now, they do, until the secret gets out.
Yeah, Jim, you made a comment. You said you think things are changing. I guess in between the relationship or the atmosphere in Israel and Palestine. Do you want to just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, here's what I'm thinking. The understandable reaction of Israel: we're going to bomb the shit out of these people. Look what they did to us. It's understandable as a first reaction. But I get plugged in directly. The conversation is changing in Israel. Conversation is now, well, what happens after? How do we end up living here? Continuing to be able to live here in peace. And on the Palestinian side, there is the official call is for a ceasefire, which I think is a very good idea. And the releasing of hostages is a very positive step. It's saying, what happens after this? How do we go beyond that? Now, there are all kinds, once you open up the question, there are all kinds of possible answers. And it's a very tricky situation. Who knows how it'll turn out? My hope, one of the reasons why I'm hopeful is that out of this, when people are beginning to talk about, well, what after the hostages, what after, we bomb Hamas or whatever. Yeah. It's the first time in a decade that people are even mentioning a two-state solution. No one's talked about that in 10 years, other than, people like myself and people like me. But it hasn't been like the political conversation. The only solution that is at all feasible is a two-state solution. What do I mean by that? And that is more or less the 67 borders, compensation for Palestinian refugees, a demilitarized Palestine, and that Jerusalem, there's no reason why Jerusalem cannot be the capital of two countries. And in fact, it is, just not officially. I think that's the reasonable solution in the end. How to get Israelis and Palestinians to believe in that is another question, especially now when they both are feeling.
Is the change coming from the younger generation?
It's hard to say right now. Here's what you see. What you see in Israel is when the country was enormously divided for about a year, all of a sudden, you've seen that old collective spirit and everybody is volunteering and doing stuff and people are talking community. I hadn't seen that in a long, long time. In fact, I'm very concerned about younger people who all want to go into high tech, make a lot of money, and we're saying why should Israel be different than any other country? I happen to believe it should be. That there is a moral standard, that after what Jews have gone through, there is a higher moral standard. And yes, we should be living up to that, or at least doing our damn best to do, to try. But so I'm beginning to see that kind of change in the Israeli population. I haven't been to Gaza. I'll tell you what my hopeful plan is, but I haven't been to Gaza in a long time. It's hard. I can't really say what the mood is on the Gaza Strip. But at least what I do know is, one, there has not been a Palestinian election since 2006 when I was an election observer. And there are very serious questions about who either Hamas or Fatah or the PLO represent. And I think there got to be some kind of process that goes on there to create democratic forums, which don't exist right now. But I can't really speak to what's going on in the street. What I hope to do, right? This is interesting, I find, for me. Now that I'm old, I can no longer allow myself to think, well, I'm going to make this commitment for the next 10 years. You know, who knows if I'll, still be functional in 10 years? What do I know? So I got to think in smaller pieces. I got to think about what can I do today, which moves the ball in the right direction, but other folks are going to have to pick up on it. So my plan is to do teaching on community building at a university in Gaza and at Sapir College, which is in Sderot, right on the other side of the border, the city that got really destroyed. That I want to teach parallel courses, but not joined courses that someone else can do 2-3 years from now when it may be possible. Then I'll have a better idea of what's going on. I don't have any firsthand knowledge of what the street's saying in Gaza. So,
Thank you.
thank you. This was your idea.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for your question, Gay, and everybody. If there's no final questions, we can wrap up, but I'll give everyone a couple minutes if there's anything else. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jim. This has been incredible.
I enjoyed it.
It's been wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is a week from today on Friday, November 3rd, 10 a.m. Pacific time. And we'll be joined by Matthew Legge, who since 2012 has worked for the Canadian Friends Service Committee, the Peace and Social Justice Agency of Quakers in Canada, who are widely respected for their efforts to prevent war and transform conflicts, as well as their impartial support for war victims. As always, if you feel called to support Cruelos and Living One and all of our sanctuary residents, please consider donating at the link on our website. But finally, once again, thank you, everybody. And thank you so much, Jim, for being with us today and taking all this time to share your wisdom and your insights. It's been incredible.
Thanks for becoming so pro-Canadian.
Yes, I guess we are. Isn't that funny? It's been wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks, you too.